Hello and welcome back to the Azerbaijan YouTube channel. It is Harry here, and today it is time for the 8th installment of the Nation Roulette series, where I take a look at football in the various countries that scatter the globe that we live on. And in today's episode, we make our second venture into the cradle of humankind in Africa with the country of the Democratic Republic of Congo. For the purposes of this video, I will also be including the period during which the Democratic Republic of Congo was known as Zaire under the tyrannic rule of President Mobutu, as opposed to just from 1997 when it reverted back to being the DR Congo. I hope that clears everything up, and without any further ado, here is a look into the footballing landscape and history in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In the late 19th century, the Congo region was under the control of Belgium who, like so many other European nations who occupied African territories during this time, exploited and abused the citizens of the country immensely, although the control wouldn't be classed as official until 1908. 11 years later, the Congolese Association Football Federation was established, although for the time being, it wouldn't really be of much use, considering that there weren't many teams until the 1930s, and the country wouldn't play their first match until 1948, when they played British Rhodesia, now known as Zambia, and beat them 3-2 in a friendly. 7 years earlier, however, the first dark moment over the country's footballing history occurred, as troops shot 100 striking workers on a football pitch, and there would be a few more incidents of violence and terror left to come in the footballing sphere. Like with many African countries in the late 1950s, still under the European colonial rule, a growing wave of calls for secession started to emerge in the region, and in 1959, a riot in Leopoldville, now known today as Kinshasa, proved a turning point for the cause, as the Belgians were subsequently stung into action. Although they originally clamped down on any hint of secession, they changed their minds completely by 1960, granting the region full independence, as they wanted to see what would happen with the quick decolonization process. The results weren't that good, but that's a different video for a different channel. A football league season in the country did take place in 1958, although as a result of the multiple political uprisings, it was put on hold until 1963, when it resumed once more. The year after this, the DR Congo were affiliated with both FIFA and CAF, but in 1965, a coup would turn the fortunes of the country upside down, although originally not for football. General Joseph Désiré Mobutu, who had a huge interest in football, ascended to the presidency after the coup, and even held a football tournament in the aftermath to celebrate his rise to presidency. Over the next few years, the Congolese economy and morale grew to record highs, and football was at the heart of it, with TP Englebert, to be renamed later on as TP Mazembe, at the forefront of it, as they reached 4 African Champions League finals in a row, winning 2 of them. In the year of their second triumph, 1968, the national team went on to win the African Cup of Nations for the first time, repeating the trick in 1974, but by which point Mobutu had essentially made himself a kleptocratic dictator and renamed the country Zaire. Despite a huge downturn in economic fortune, the football team still continued to prosper, and a World Cup qualification was almost inevitable. Sure enough, they would become the first sub-Saharan African nation to qualify for a World Cup, taking part in the 1974 finals in West Germany. Drawn in a group with Scotland, Brazil and Yugoslavia, they were almost immediately written off before the tournament had even begun, despite being reigning African champions, with Scotland's manager claiming that they would assuredly beat the Zaire national team by more than 2 goals. In the end, they only lost 2-0 in a really spirited and positive performance, but their campaign would end up being unlike any other that we have seen before or since. Their next game against Yugoslavia was shrouded in controversy before the match had even begun, as the money which had been promised to the team had been spent by the officials who had travelled with the team by the end of the first game, meaning that they wouldn't be paid for their next 2 matches. They were, essentially, slaves on the pitch. The players, who were understandably outraged, threatened a boycott, but FIFA, assumingly so as not to besmirch their own reputation, swayed them around to play the match. Many of the players who played that day have since described that game as a protest match, deliberately not playing with the same intensity and panache that they had before after the first quarter of the game had elapsed. Within 30 minutes, it was 3-0, and after the third goal went in, the Congolese manager substituted their goalkeeper for a new one off the bench, but that plan didn't work, and they were 6-0 down by half-time. By the end of the game, they conceded 9 without even scoring once, which is a joint record World Cup defeat, and Mobutu, incandescent with rage, told the players that if they lost by more than 3 goals to Brazil, their access back into the country would be denied. Mercifully, they only lost 3-0, with one of their players charging out of a wall set up to defend a Brazil free kick and kicking the ball away in protest, as he wanted to be sent off to make a statement. At the time, the commentators presumed it to be quote-unquote African naivety, as they presumably didn't know the rules. Right, okay then, but in reality, it was because they were petrified for their lives. Just 6 years on from an elaborate return to the country after winning the African Cup of Nations, during which they were showered with gifts by President Mobutu, no one greeted them upon their arrival back into Zaire after the 1974 World Cup campaign, and many of the squad would disappear into obscurity. It has proven to be the country's only World Cup appearance to date, and after this disaster, Mobutu withdrew his interest in football completely. As the economy began to decline even more spectacularly than before, so did the fortunes of the Zaire team, and in 1976, just 2 years on from what was meant to be their heyday, they were unceremoniously knocked out in the group stages of the African Cup of Nations, failing to qualify again until 1988, and only once between 1978 and 1992. Indeed, the squad was still vilified and subject to unfair treatment, with the money that was promised to them for their 1996 African Cup of Nations tournament being transferred instead to be put towards a new villa for the team's senior administrator instead of going to the players. In spite of this, they still reached the quarterfinals, and just 2 years on, they would achieve their joint best finish in the tournament since 1974, coming third in Burkina Faso, and they would come third again in 2015. Political unrest continued, as Mobutu was by now extremely unpopular both at home and abroad, with US diplomats criticising his rule and France reducing their monetary aid that was sent to the country. Whilst Mobutu was abroad in Morocco in 1996, a coup was staged, and when negotiations between the two parties failed, they forced their way back into power and Mobutu was exiled. The country changed its name back to the Democratic Republic of Congo, but the transfer of power would not be smooth in any way, with the country being anything but democratic as a result of the new president's own desire for power and one of the bloodiest conflicts in the modern era subsequently ensuing. Over the next 5 years, more than 3 million people would be killed and many more would be left in severe destitution, and set against this political backdrop, it is perhaps unsurprising that many Congolese players decided to up sticks and move abroad in search of better opportunities. Yet again, the economy was in ruins and the team suffered as a result, only being able to fund their 2004 African Cup of Nations campaign by virtue of Egypt, who were the hosts of that tournament, paying for both their flights and accommodation, as no money would be given to them by their own government. They would lose all 3 group stage games anyway and were subsequently on the plane back home at the earliest possible opportunity. It would take the best part of a decade before peace could be truly established in the country, but there were 2 noticeable stadium disasters in the meantime, both of which involved games with TP Mazembe. The first was in 2001, when riots broke out in a match against FC Santerwa Lupopo and 7 people were killed, and the second in 2016, when police tear gas led to a stampede and 15 more casualties. In spite of all this, Mazembe actually started to flourish in the post-Mobutu era, and as the economy finally found some form of stability, TP were the footballing team who benefited the most. With a club president who was at the time an ally of national president Kabila, they built a $35 million stadium and had enough funds left over to pay their team $10 million annually, meaning that they were able to attract Africa's best players and keep theirs at home. Since 2009, they have won all but 3 of the country's league titles, including last season despite its cancellation, picking up 3 African Champions League trophies along the way, and they became the first African team to reach the final of the Club World Cup in 2010, beating Pachuca and Internacional of Mexico and Brazil respectively, before losing to Inter Milan in the final. It should come as little surprise, therefore, that Mazembe are, historically, the most successful club in the Linefoot, the top tier of Congolese football, with 17 titles to their name, although AS Vita Club run them close with 14, including 7 during an 11-year spell between 1970 and 1980. The league nowadays consists of 16 teams, with 3 of them being relegated, but from 2015 to 2018, 28 teams would take part in it, and the league was split into 3 regions, those being East, West and Centre-South, with the top teams from each section qualifying for the final National League. And before that, the league fluctuated between 16 and 14 teams. The national team are now experiencing an upturn in fortunes once again, with a squad that can boast the likes of Cedric Bukambu, Arthur Masuaku, Yannick Bolasie and Chancellor Mbemba, currently sitting in 59th in the FIFA World Rankings, although they did reach a high of 28th in 2017. Isama Mpeku is their most capped player with 71 caps to date, and Diomansy Mbakani, who used to play for Norwich, is their highest goal scorer of all time, although he has scored just 18 goals for the national side, meaning he must be one of the lowest scoring highest goal scorers for any national team in the top 100 of FIFA's World Rankings, if that makes any sense. Their record win was in 1969 when they beat Zambia 10-1, although their record defeat has already been mentioned, with that 9-0 loss to Yugoslavia at the 1974 World Cup, yet to be surpassed to date. That just about wraps up today's video on the history of football in the Democratic of Congo / Zaire. If you've missed any of the episodes thus far, a link to the playlist is down in the description, and whilst you're there, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and of course subscribe while you're at it. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you then.